The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marcel Vanderweer, editor of OHS Canada. I'd like to say welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today's webinar, Leading Edge and Sharp Edge Training, will delve into challenges and solutions associated with leading edge and sharp edge when it comes to fall protection for construction workers. Much of the focus will be on self-retracting lifelines. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the GoToWebinar interface, and I will ask it at the end of the presentation. With that, I'd like to introduce Don Medeiros. He is a senior safety applications professional with 3M, working out of their fall protection plant in Mississauga, Ontario. Over to you, Don.
Thanks, Marcel. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. You're probably on your lunch break or taking some time out, at least in your busy lives. So thank you for taking some time today about safety and sharing some knowledge. I'm a health and safety advocate, and I'm just trying to share my expertise today with you regarding leading edge SRLs. So thanks for that intro, Marcel. As we move through the presentation, yeah, there's a little bit about myself. I'm not going to speak to it verbatim, but I've been at this a little while, past 17 years or so. I've been practicing occupational health and safety, predominantly in construction. Yeah, in the last 4 years or so, I've focused very hard on fall protection because that is an area where we've sort of flatlined in terms of success. We continue to see serious injuries and fatalities in regards to fall protection, and that's just a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. So before we get right into the topic of leading edge applications with SRLs, there are three important points I'd like to bring up about the change in the CSA standard regarding self-retracting lifelines. So firstly, for those that may not be aware, the standard changed effective August 1st, 2019. And as you see on the screen, there is an asterisk, and looking down to the bottom of this slide, it says new SRL standard went into effect for manufacturers certifying products to CSA. So how this impacts legislation is a totally different subject. And there'll be an opportunity at the end if you still need some clarification about how this affects you, the user, or you, the supervisor, safety professional, whoever you may be, how it applies to you is very important. So I just want to highlight this off the top. This is a date that went into effect for manufacturing. So 3M, as a manufacturer of fall protection equipment and SRLs specifically, we now produce SRLs to 4 new classes. So it used to be type 1, type 2, type 3 under the previous CSA standard. Now it is 4 classes. Firstly, SRL, SRL LE, LE for leading edge, of course, SRL R for rescue, and SRL LER, which is a combination of both of the last 2 classes. So change in classification, that's very important to realize, and knowing if you have the right equipment on hand for the application you're using it in. Secondly, new revalidation regimen. So in this new CSA standard, it indicates inspection by competent person and revalidation by authorized service center is done a little bit differently, quite a bit differently, in fact. Before, it was determined by CSA in the standard, first 2 years and then 1 year every thereafter for type 2 and type 3 SRLs. Now it's basically up to the competent person, whether in-house at the employer or an external person, that does these inspections, and some companies do it this way, do it externally. Competent person will essentially determine the inspection period and selects revalidation regimen. So what that means is, depending upon your use, that will dictate how often you do a competent person inspection and revalidation. So, for example, the categories of type of use are infrequent to light, moderate to heavy, and thirdly, severe to continuous. So, depending on what category you fall into, your competent person inspection frequency can either be annually, semi-annually, or quarterly. And product revalidation, that's authorized service center type work. So, sending that back to 3M or an authorized service center for inspection to revalidate, or in other words, recertify the device. The ranges are every 5 years, every 2 years, or at least annually, depending upon, again, the type of use. Finally, anchoring below elevation of dorsal D-ring of full body harness requires leading edge. This is a big change for a lot of folks. So I say here, major shift in work procedures and re-evaluation of SRL use in many applications. So before, many different SRLs, especially personal SRLs that where the housing is actually connected to the dorsal D-ring of the harness. Some of those that you might have used in the past, under the new standard for new equipment, you can't use them exactly the same way you previously had. So under the new standard, it means, if you're tying off to an anchor below your D-ring area, if it's a new piece of equipment, if it's a new SRL, manufactured under the new standard, it has to be an SRL type LE, okay? It has to be a leading edge model. Elevated work platforms, EWPs, and scaffolding in particular, these sorts of applications, they need to move to SRL-LE models, okay? Again, so leading edge models. So there are different opinions out there about this CSA directive in the latest standard. Making everybody use a leading edge model, tying off below the D-ring, whether they might be exposed to a leading edge or not, is a source of some questioning by a few, but it does simplify the process and makes it easier to follow. So I haven't been on the technical committees for CSA, although colleagues of mine have. This is my understanding as an outsider of why it came to be, but that's beyond the scope of this session. So just so you know, that is an important change. Any new SRL made under the new standard, if you are tying off below the dorsal D-ring, it must be a leading edge model. Okay, so key questions to ask about leading edge and sharp edge applications and products. You want to keep these in mind at the outset, and then as we finish today's session, you want to make sure you're clear on these. Okay, so firstly, does the product meet CSA Z259.2.2-17? So that is the standard we are talking about today, the current standard that we are manufacturing to. So is it a leading edge product, in other words, okay? And we're going to talk about how we distinguish between leading edge and non-leading edge products, very important. Secondly, how do I know the product meets Z259.2.2? Okay, so we're going to talk about the differences between the old standard and the new and how to readily identify. What is the setback? Okay, so we're going to talk about setback, what that means in terms of using a self-retracting lifeline in a horizontal anchorage position. Now we'll talk about the surfaces people work from in the construction industry in general that are important to this standard. Questions like under I-beam, okay, steel I-beam, can I anchor to an I-beam directly at my feet? It's a common question, and you have to be clear about this kind of stuff. Your life is on the line, and you want to make sure that you can do so safely. In terms of concrete edges, there's other considerations, but again, it's similar. Can I anchor to rebar near a concrete edge directly at my feet? What are the clearance requirements? Okay, in both cases, you can ask. Okay, so these are key questions to keep in your mind, and you might have some others. Again, there will be a question period at the end where we can help to answer some of those questions. Okay, what is leading edge compliant? So it must meet CSA standard Z259.2.2, and the current standard has a -17 after that, as you saw on the previous slide. So, you know, what do we mean by leading edges, first of all, and sharp edges? So basically, the standard is concerned with edges, an edge significantly smaller than the radius of a pencil, okay? So it's something that isn't readily, you know, obvious to the naked eye, but common surfaces like unfinished concrete slabs, steel I-beam can fall in this category. And we have to make sure we have a leading edge compliant product. Why? Because we know that SRLs that aren't leading edge, that aren't made for the hazard of the cable or lifeline going across it, falling across it, you know. So we are concerned with the potential for failure, and we want to make sure we have the right product for the application. So under CSA, they have deemed what is constitutes a sharp enough edge for testing is, as you can see from that pictogram at the top right corner with the triangle, which looks like a cable going over a metal edge. Anything that is 0.01 inches, okay, or more, okay. In the US, so I should say underneath that, as you can see in bold, in Canada, there is no distinction that separates leading edge from sharp edge. So in the ANSI standard, stateside, they have a different number. It's even less than that, 0.005 inches, so about half that much, and even sharper edge they test to. Regardless, if there's any question, you know, there are measuring tools that you can measure the edge itself, but a good rule of thumb that is easy for anybody to kind of gauge, hey, should we consider using a leading edge product here? If you were to depress your index finger on the edge surface and give it a good press, and as you take your finger off, if you notice that line you know, when you press on something fairly sharp, if there's a line embedded in your skin and it takes quite a while to dissipate, and you might even feel a little bit of pain or pressure at that point, you know, that's basically a good rule of thumb to say, hey, we probably need a leading edge product here. Okay, so a lot of common construction applications, like I said off the top, if you're using an SRL in a horizontal mode, you're likely going to need a leading edge product. Excuse me. Sorry, getting over the flu here. Okay, so all CSA SRL-LE models are tested over a sharp edge to receive the designation, and typically it's metal or concrete. It keeps forces below 8 kilonewtons, and you know, other typical SRLs are even below this, but in order to pass the testing regimen, that's the max. And it must meet foot level anchorage and offset anchorage as well. Okay, so let's talk about identifying products out there and knowing if I have a leading edge product or not. So all 3M, DBI-SALA, and Protecta leading edge, sharp edge SRLs are designated with an orange triangle symbol or orange shock pack or housing. So you're going to see that triangle for any of the products that 3M manufactures with that edge symbol with the cable. So as you look to the right side of this slide, you'll notice we have a personal SRL, a dual personal SRL there called the Nano-Lok Edge. And it is orange in color. It has that pictogram. The next one over on the right in the dark blue is our Smart Lock leading edge SRL. It has an orange energy absorber external to it, as you can see near the snap hook. And then the lower two models there, these pictures were taken earlier, so I understand some changes have been made since then, but at the time of this presentation development, the pictograms were not available. So this is the way 3M identifies its products for leading edge, so it is quick to recognize immediately in the field. There are some other things that go into it, such as there has to be the CSA standard marked on the unit, and it will say CSA Z 259.2.2-17. So previous models manufactured under the old standard will not have the -17 at the end. Very important. That one is not unique to 3M. That is for anyone across the board manufacturing a CSA model SRL that is leading edge. So to be clear, this orange pictogram, you will not see this on all fall protection products. That one is specific to 3M to, again, make it as easy as possible to identify in the field. Okay, so let's talk about fall clearance, because using a leading edge SRL in a horizontal fashion definitely impacts fall clearance. So this is a standard fall clearance calculation chart from our website. And this is something that is taught in just about every fall protection class. And we need to understand that, you know, for a lanyard, as an example, a typical lanyard setup, as you see in the picture there, will have a significant clearance required. Okay, so so the two are different, but as you can see in the second point there on the left, lanyard clearance is calculated in this example at 17.5 feet from the anchor point. Okay, so this is a typical example. If we look to the actual picture here and look at the individual working from the surface, the LL in this case, the length of lanyard is 6 feet, which is a standard length of lanyard out there and on the market. Then you add the deceleration distance. So, you know, that varies, of course, with many lanyards, but what is common is about 4 feet. So deceleration distance is that distance that it takes for the energy absorber to start working with the lanyard. So then it actually extends the full length of the lanyard. So then you're at about 10 feet, okay, 6 plus 4. Then the height of suspended worker, okay, that's another 6 feet to add there. So you're at 16. And then down to the nearest obstruction, we add a safety factor of about 1.5. Of course, that is up to the user, how much safety factor they want to build in. But that's a standard number that we use. So you end up at 17.5 feet with a standard lanyard in a standard configuration. Okay, this is important as we discuss the SRLs, and I want to stage the conversation with this example first. Now, with an SRL, clearance is calculated from working level based on anchor point locations circled below. So this is a graph taken from one of our user manuals. And you will find a graph like this in any of our self-retracting Lifeline leading edge user manuals. It actually makes things a lot easier. I was very happy when I first started seeing these because less math for the end user to do. This has been done in the lab with testing, and basically helps you determine what your fall clearance, will be. So if we look at these red circles here, I'm going to point to the lowest one near the worker's feet in this chart. As you can see, the graph goes in increments of 1 feet, okay? And it also says do not tie off below feet. So your working range is clearly identified here. If we look at the first red circle, the lowest one, closest to the worker's feet, you can see that the worker is situated about 2 feet away from their anchor point, and their anchor point is right at their foot level. If we're to run our finger across this band, we can see that the fall clearance is identified on the right, and it says 16 feet. So in comparison to the previous example where a worker had a standard lanyard tied off above their head, this actually offers a better situation, less fall clearance needed, 16 feet in this example, and the person is actually tied off below their feet. Okay, so, but as you can see, you know, if we are changing the parameters, it can get better for this person. If they happen to tie off above their head, they're using a self-retracting lifeline. It's going to engage pretty quickly as you start to accelerate from a fall force. And so you can see in the a red circle above that user's head, there is a 7-foot clearance band. Depending on how you're using the device, it obviously varies, but the calculation is basically done for you, which is a plus. Sorry, I advanced a couple of slides there. Here we go. The next slide, as you can see, it's similar, but there is a larger dotted area where it says do not tie off. Now this is for workers in a heavier weight range, and it says workers between 310 and 420 pounds. So although they have a leading edge model, the design parameters of that model do not allow such a user to tie off at foot level. Their fall clearance is similar. You follow your finger to the area where they would be tying off. So how many feet above or below, and how many feet to the left or the right. And you can see it's similar in that regard, except we brought it up to almost the hip level, basically. Okay. Notice in the second bullet point on the left, tying off while sitting down on working level is acceptable. So you can picture this worker if they were crouched down, similar to that very first slide in our opening of this presentation. There was what appears to be an iron worker sitting on a piece of steel. That could be acceptable use in this context. Okay, but ultimately refer to user instructions for applicable products. So that definitely, you know, this is where this information is coming from, right from a user manual. You have to be very familiar with your manual so you know fully what the capabilities and also the limitations of the product are. Okay, let's talk more specifically about calculating leading edge clearance for SRLs. Okay, so this is just a side-by-side of what we were just discussing, okay? The two figures, the first one is user weight up to 310 pounds. And then the next one, again, 310 to 420, you are limited somewhat, okay? And although it's a leading edge model, it's not to be taken for granted just because it says that on the label of the product. You have to be familiar with the user instructions because there are different design parameters. What the equipment can and can't do is crucial, right? Our lives are on the line. We have to be clear about this stuff. Okay, so conversely, if you are in a lighter weight class with this particular product, okay, the Nano-Lok Edge, you can have even better fall clearance numbers. You have more advantages. So those are a couple of common models that we're showing there on the left. But if you look at the picture on the right, it's talking about setback can be 0 feet if tied directly at feet. And there's a chart here that's highlighted, and it says at the top of it, in the highlighted area, for users up to 220 pounds. So this is a specific chart for those users. And you'll notice the clearance required is a little bit better. Okay, so going across the top in this table, it has the designation A, clearance required when falling over an edge. And then below that, distance along the edge is designated B. And on the left side, the other axis, setback distance C. So if we just start at the very beginning, 0 and 0. So setback is the distance back to the anchor from the edge, okay? C at 0 feet, let's say that the user is actually tied off right at the edge. The anchor point is right at the edge with them at their feet. And then distance along the edge, or the perpendicular distance, let's say travel side to side, let's say that's at 0. So they're right at their feet. Best case scenario in that case, the clearance is 14 feet 2 inches. Okay. As we move along either way, the numbers change. So if we increase our setback, how far back the anchor is, we improve the clearance numbers. So there's less free fall, less line going over. So you can see with as little as 1 foot setback, we get a better clearance number, 13 feet 8 inches. Okay. So the overall overarching point here at the bottom, users weighing under 220 pounds can have less fall clearance if needed by using the chart in red. Okay. So again, very important to be familiar with that particular model, the user instructions. Of course, we say familiarize yourself with the user instructions before use, but we actually here at 3M, we advise, before you buy, be familiar with the equipment that you're buying. We try to do our best to put as much information on the website as possible on the individual web pages, but the links to the product manuals are also there. And this is an area where sometimes people forget to check out before they make an investment in product. So be familiar with your instruction manuals. Talking about another model, okay, this is not a personal SRL, not the small housing type that you mount to the harness. Okay, this is a more of a traditional style block. You have 2 examples there of the Smart Lock, the 20-foot, 30-foot. Both are leading edge models, as you can see. It has a similar chart. Okay, the way the letters are organized are a little bit different. In this case, C is the clearance required. B is your distance perpendicular, or your side distance, and A is your setback distance. So we're going to go a little bit closer to understand this better. We're going to go to the next slide, which shows that the picture that you see in the top right corner a little bit more up close. So first of all, let's take a breather to make sure we understand the terminology here. Okay, so setback distance is A. So you can see there's 2 scenarios provided in this picture. One where the worker is on the left side, and one where the worker is on the right side, where they're sort of grayed out a little bit. So just so you can distinguish between the 2 scenarios, okay? So as you can see, the worker on the left, their fall clearance looks to be a lot more initially, just from where they're situated and where their anchor point is. So if you look at C, where that worker is standing, versus C, where the worker on the right is standing, quite a bit different, right? There's a lower roof where the other worker is closer to on the right side, and the worker on the left side has a lot more clearance available. If we look at B, the distance to perpendicular, the worker on the left is quite a bit away from their anchor point. But again, they have more clearance, so they might be able to get away with that. Then the worker on the right, where they are just looks like a few feet over. And finally, A, setback distance. It looks pretty similar in both cases to where those workers are situated. So the reason that we show a picture like this is you have to be aware of your surroundings. Your clearance can change depending on where you travel to. So, you have to make sure you plan accordingly for your setback distance and your offset or perpendicular distance. Okay, but again, going in this example, let's look at the chart on the bottom left. You have B, distance perpendicular, start at 0, and A, setback distance is 2 feet, not 0 feet, notice, it is 2 feet, okay? That is the minimum setback you need for this device. Okay, your fall clearance is at about 15 feet, okay? So similar to the Nano-Lok, except the Nano-Lok edge, it allowed you to tie off right to your feet. Now in this case, if I go back one slide, you notice we're not talking about a personal SRL with a small housing that's mounted to the back. We have a more traditional style SRL block where the part that is closest to the anchor is the block itself, the housing, and the part that is attached to the worker's harness is where you see that snap hook at the end with the energy absorber closest to it. So you can imagine if you had this rigged right at your feet and we're trying to tie off with this device, if you were to go over, the housing would be perched over the edge. And there would be an extreme force put on that housing that would likely not be uniform and not allow the lifeline to function properly in that case. So that's why, as I move back to the current slide, there is a setback distance of at least 2 feet, okay? And this is something we have to be aware of. It is a limitation just by the design and the type of SRL that we are using. Notice, as we look at this graph and we look to the right, we start to see some boxes X'd out. So for B, your swing fall distance, your distance of perpendicular, notice at 2 feet setback, as soon as we get 5 feet out from our perpendicular, okay, we're moving to the side now, you cannot do it, okay? However, if you have 5 feet setback, your A item is 5 feet, you can go 5 feet out to the side, okay? And your clearance is 17.1 feet at this point, not 15, but 17.1 feet. So as you can tell, this really lends to planning. We really have to know before we're doing the work, how far out do we need to go? How far back do we need to set our anchor? Okay, Ultra-Lok leading edge SRLs, another product, but similar to the Smart Lock. Okay, minimum setback is defined as 18 inches in this case, so 1.5 feet instead of 2 feet, so a little bit closer. But as you can see, SRL LE housing must never extend over edge. You need a clear path for the cable to go over the edge and for the unit to lock up when an arrest happens so that it's done effectively and as per design and test. Minimum required clearance required from leading edge, again, is similar, 15 feet. Additional clearance is required, again, for swing fall situations. On swing fall, very important, in any fall protection course you take, swing fall is emphasized as something you don't want to be involved in. So, your lateral movement should be minimized wherever possible. If you need additional anchor points planned in, that's very prudent to do. You want to minimize your swing fall as much as possible. As we saw in those previous pictures of the workers on the roof example, if you have a little bit of swing fall, it's obviously the product has been tested. You're using it within the parameters of those tables and graphs. Excellent. But if you can minimize swing fall, by all means, do so. Okay, and finally, just another one of our products. This one is popular in the construction segment, the Protecta. And you can see there's a wide offering of length available of cable. But yeah, the graph is the same, except again, notice at the 0 feet and 2 feet mark of both A and B at the top left quadrant of this chart, we're not at 15 feet, we're at 16.5 feet initial clearance. Okay, so different product, different design and testing parameters, so it's actually not as good as the others in terms of your clearance numbers. As you move across, you'll find the same is true. But if you use it within those parameters, you're going to be safe. Finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss harnesses that are made for personal SRLs, especially those that tie off below the D-ring to anchorages, and what is available out there. So some of the product that you've seen, you should be aware that there are ways to attach them to your harness, particularly the personal SRLs, without using the dorsal D-ring. So essentially keeping the D-ring free for potentially a lanyard if you want to be versatile that way, or even for emergency access because you cannot connect two components to the one dorsal D-ring. Okay, so we have special adapters on select harnesses that we offer, and I know this is similar across the marketplace. You see for the model on the left, the ExoFit Strata. It has a hardware connection called the EasyLink SRL adapter, which accommodates these smaller personal SRLs very well, and leaves, again, that dorsal D-ring available for other activities. The particular model on the left, you notice there's an arrow there. It says Lift Tech, removes 85% of weight off shoulders. So this is something that not everybody is aware of. So, you know, having a couple of SRLs on your back for, you know, depending if you work all day with a harness, it does leave an impression on you. The weight is felt. However, with this Lift Tech technology, it disperses a lot of the weight from the shoulder area to the hips. So I can personally attest to this. It is unbelievable the difference that you feel. So very important to be aware of this, especially with the increased popularity of leading edge and personal SRL models, that there is stuff like this out there. As we move to the right, as you can see, there are other options as well. The Protecta harness on the far right has a quick link SRL adapter, which is basically a web loop instead of hardware, as with the ExoFit Strata. Again, accomplishes the same thing, allows you to attach the personal SRL. That is basically all I had this afternoon. I'd like to thank you all again for joining me, and I hope it's been enlightening. If you have any questions, I'm going to pass it off to Marcel to lead us through this segment.
Thank you, Don. Excellent presentation. And we do have a number of questions from the audience. To begin, there is a question: do you need to buy new products to be compliant to the new standard?
Great question. This is a common one we do get here from our technical support line here in Mississauga. So the August 1st date that I mentioned, 2019, last year, that was a date for manufacturers. So 3M is a manufacturer of self-retracting lifelines. To certify to the new standard, we have to make SRLs to that standard. However, we all recognize that there are perfectly fine SRLs all over the country that are in use to this very day and will continue. That is fine, and basically it's ultimately dependent upon your local legislation. So what that means is, what CSA standard does your local legislation for occupational health and safety, what CSA standard does it mention for SRL? Okay, so the CSA standard Z259.2.2-17, very important. 17 is the year of the standard, and that is for all intents and purposes, your leading edge effective standard. Okay, so products that are made to that standard, great. They might supersede your local legislation. I can speak to those that might be on the call that are from Ontario. Working with the construction regulations here, that's one that I've been using for a number of years for working for various employers in my past. And they are still citing a much older SRL standard. So if you are buying new product and it happens to be to the new standard, great, you're improving your gear. But the legislation, what it prescribes, it must at least be, the one that is mentioned. And I know it's a couple of decades old, the one in the current Ontario construction regulation. But in other provinces, your occupational health and safety legislation is different. So there are a couple of jurisdictions I'm aware of out there that the latest standard is what you must be using. So unfortunately for those folks, they have to move quite quickly to change out their equipment to meet the current standard because that's what's written in the legislation.
Excellent, Don. We actually have about 6 or 7 questions. Let me know how you're able to answer them. But your second one is, if you have items in service to the old standard, are they still compliant under the new regulation?
So, broadly speaking, if you have an SRL made under the old standard, so made before August 1st, 2019, and doesn't have the -17 designation at the end, that follows the revalidation regimen or recertification regimen under that standard. So 2 years from date of manufacturer, followed by every year thereafter. So that doesn't change. That device was manufactured under that standard. So you get it inspected, recertified according to that standard. So for those of you that will have inventory under both, the old and the new standard, you have some new SRLs in your inventory and some of the older. That is a task that I don't admire. That is organization you have to make sure that you follow for your inventory and to make sure that you're meeting minimum requirements for that. So if you have a new SRL under the new standard, yes, you have to get it revalidated according to the new requirements, which is basically up to the employer to see what type of use that you have and how you are going to manage it. Now, I should say before you move on, Marcel, so again, with the legislation of how you use your fall protection product, what is the minimum requirement? The previous question is quite different from the revalidation regimen. Okay, so that is a CSA guiding piece, whereas the first one was based on legislation.
Okay. Don, the next question is, what would you suggest in terms of managing inventory if half your workers are working in leading edge applications and the other half are not?
That's a good question as well. So although leading edge SRLs typically can be used in both vertical and horizontal anchorage applications, which adds some versatility to that product, because traditional SRLs can only be attached overhead, as we know. However, I would not recommend anyone completely clear out their older SRLs, especially if they continue to pass competent person inspection and revalidation, because they are very useful in still anchoring overhead. Although you can use a leading edge SRL anchored overhead, in most cases, again, consult your instruction manual for your product, you typically have an external energy absorber on said model. So fall clearance is still very important in how you plan your fall protection application. So if clearance is minimal, given your current work scope, you might only be able to do it with a traditional SRL, which is not leading edge. And so to answer the question, if if about half of your staff, half of your inventory, excuse me, is traditional SRL and half of it is leading edge. If that seems to be working for your work group, your labor force, I would keep it at the same. You might have more on the leading edge side if you find out you're doing more and more horizontal work, but again, you wouldn't need to change anything at the outset if everything is equal.
Okay. We had a viewer ask, are there 6-foot leading edge SRLs?
Yeah, I believe there are 6-foot leading edge SRLs on the market. Ours start at 8 feet, but there are, I believe, on the market a few that are 6 feet. So.
Okay. Another question was, how heavy are the personal SRLs?
Good question. If all you need is one on your back, then I'd say keep it at one. You do notice it. Definitely, it is different compared to a lanyard, especially if it has a large steel rebar hook. You're going to be connecting that to park it on your harness. The housing itself, it's pretty good for the products. I can speak to our products. Pretty light in general, but as I said, if you're a person that uses it all day, it is a significant amount of weight. We have different weights that are mentioned on our website for our different products, so it varies. I can't give you a specific number; it varies. But definitely, if you don't need to, stick with one. You're doubling your weight otherwise. And minimize it. If you're not using it all day, if you're not wearing it all day, it's negligible, I would say.
All right. A follow-up question was, will there be an SRL design where the mechanism is on the anchor point and not on the back of the end user?
Where the mechanism is on the anchor point. If I'm not sure I understand the question fully, but I'm going to assume that they meant the housing. So, difficult to understand the question clearly, but assuming for now that they meant the housing. So we talked about two different styles: personal SRLs, where the housing is on your back, basically connected to your dorsal D-ring or just below. But we also talked about models where the housing is not allowed at all to go on your back, and it is right at the anchor point. So we talked about the Smart Lock, the Protect, and the Ultra Lock, all being models where the housing is at the anchor point and not at the worker.
Okay. There's a few more questions. Some might be more confusing and might be directed to Don via email, which I'll explain later. Don, what is the maximum authorized service center interval that can be assigned to an SRL? Is that something you can answer?
Yeah, we spoke to it during the presentation. So under the new standard, the maximum revalidation period is 5 years. That's basically light and frequent use. That's the current standard, the -17. The previous standard didn't allow for that. It was basically every year after the first 2 years. So the range, just to finish that off, the range is either 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years for revalidation, or in other words, recertification of the unit under the new standard.
Okay. Great. One of the viewers found there was some confusion. I believe it was the first calculating fall clearance diagram as to how you calculated 16 feet. Is that something you can go through now, or would you prefer that by email?
Probably by email is best. So
Okay.
easily can get confusing talking about the different numbers, different charts I was going through. So definitely feel free to reach out to me via email. I understand, Marcel, you're going to provide that at the end of the broadcast here.
Yeah. Okay. We have 2 more questions, and yeah, I think that will be it. But one of the questions is, can we use our current harnesses with the leading edge SRLs, or will we need to purchase harnesses that are designed to tie off below the D-ring?
Great question. So let me make sure I dispel that. No, you don't need a special harness to use a leading edge SRL. The harness discussion at the end I mentioned was specifically about personal SRLs and how advantageous it can be to have that separate connection. But no, you do not need any specialty harness in order to use a leading edge SRL.
Great. And then our final question for you, Don, is someone asks, we currently use the DBI-SALA twin retractable lanyard. What is the weight difference with the new leading edge twin lanyard? And then there's a comment that cable versus webbing, I am worried it will be significant. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So not sure exactly which models this user is interested in, but again, following up through email, we can definitely leave no doubt in terms of what specific models they're interested in and the difference between a web model versus a cable model. Generally speaking, yes, wire rope cable will add weight to the unit, and that is definitely a concern for those that might wear, again, a harness with SRLs all day, every day of the week. So definitely a good question. And what I've found from trying different products from different manufacturers, it really does vary quite a bit. I've had some SRL web models on my back that are quite heavy, that I was quite surprised. So it is not definitely cut and dry. It's not an absolute. So although cable tends to add weight, not in every case. It really depends on the design of the specific model.
Great. So that's all the questions we have. I'd like to thank everyone who attended today. If you think of a question later that you'd like answered, Don has indicated he's willing to accept questions by email. And his email address is dmedeiros2@mmm.com. So dmedeiros2@mmm.com. Also, if you'd like to watch the presentation again or share it with a colleague, a recording of today's presentation will be sent to you in 24 hours. Thank you so much, everyone.